Idleness, vice, and intemperance had done their miserable work, and the dead mother lay cold and still amid her wretched children. She had fallen upon the threshold of her own door in a drunken fit and died in the presence of her frightened little ones. Death touches the spring of our common humanity. This woman had been despised, scoffed at, and angrily denounced by nearly every man, woman, and child in the village. But now, as the fact of her death was passed from lip to lip in subdued tones, pity took the place of anger, and sorrow replaced denunciation. Neighbors went hastily to the old tumble-down hut in which she had secured little more than a place of shelter from summer heats and winter cold, some with grave clothes for a decent interment of the body, and some with food for the half-starving children, 3 in number. Of these, John, the oldest, a boy of 12, was a stout lad, able to earn his living with any farmer. Kate, between 10 and 11, was a bright, active girl, out of whom something clever might be made if in good hands. But poor little Maggie, the youngest, was hopelessly diseased. 2 years before, a fall from a window had injured her spine, and she had not been able to leave her bed since, except when lifted in the arms of her mother. What is to be done with the children? That was the chief question now. The dead mother would go underground and be forever beyond all care or concern of the villagers. But the children must not be left to starve. After considering the matter and talking it over with his wife, Farmer Jones said that he would take John and do well by him now that his mother was out of the way. And Mrs. Ellis, who had been looking out for a bound girl, concluded that it would be charitable to make choice of Kate, even though she was too young to be of much use for several years. "I could do much better, I know," said Mrs. Ellis. "But as no one seems inclined to take her, I must act from a sense of duty. I expect to have trouble with the child, for she's an undisciplined thing, used to having her own way." But no one said, "I'll take Maggie." Pitying glances were cast on her wan and wasted form, and thoughts were troubled on her account. Mothers brought cast-off garments and, removing her soiled and ragged clothes, dressed her in clean attire. The sad eyes and patient face of the little one touched many hearts and even knocked at them for entrance. But none opened to take her in. Who wanted a bedridden child? "Take her to the poorhouse," said a rough man, of whom the question, "What's to be done with Maggie?" was asked. "Nobody's going to be bothered with her." "The poorhouse is a sad place for a sick and helpless child," answered one. "For your child or mine," said the other, speaking lightly. "But for this brat it will prove a blessed change. She will be kept clean, have healthy food, and be doctored, which is more than can be said of her past condition." There was reason in that, but still it didn't satisfy. The day following the day of death was made the day of burial. A few neighbors were at the miserable hovel, but none followed the dead cart as it bore the unhonored remains to its pauper grave. Farmer Jones, after the coffin was taken out, placed John in his wagon and drove away, satisfied that he had done his part. Mrs. Ellis spoke to Kate with a hurried air, "Bid your sister goodbye," and drew the tearful children apart before their lips had scarcely touched in a sobbing farewell. Hastily, others went out, some glancing at Maggie and some resolutely refraining from a look until all had gone. She was alone. Just beyond the threshold, Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, paused and said to the blacksmith's wife, who was hastening off with the rest, "It's a cruel thing to leave her so." "Then take her to the poorhouse. She'll have to go there," answered the blacksmith's wife, springing away and leaving Joe behind. For a little while, the man stood with a puzzled air. Then he turned back and went into the hovel again. Maggie, with painful effort, had raised herself to an upright position and was sitting on the bed, straining her eyes upon the door out of which all had just departed. A vague terror had come into her thin white face. "Oh, Mr. Thompson!" she cried out, catching her suspended breath. "Don't leave me here all alone." Though rough in exterior, Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, had a heart, and it was very tender in some places. He liked children and was pleased to have them come to his shop, where sleds and wagons were made or mended for the village lads without a draft on their hoarded sixpences. "No, dear," he answered in a kind voice, going to the bed and stooping down over the child. "You shan't be left here alone." Then he wrapped her, with the gentleness almost of a woman, in the clean bedclothes which some neighbor had brought, and lifting her in his strong arms, bore her out into the air and across the field that lay between the hovel and his home. Now Joe Thompson's wife, who happened to be childless, was not a woman of saintly temper, nor much given to self-denial for others' good, and Joe had well-grounded doubts about the manner of greeting he would receive on his arrival. Mrs. Thompson saw him approaching from the window and, with ruffled feathers, met him a few paces from the door as he opened the garden gate and came in. He bore a precious burden and felt it to be so. As his arms held the sick child to his breast, a sphere of tenderness went out from her and penetrated his feelings. A bond had already formed around them both, and love was springing into life. "What have you there?" sharply questioned Mrs. Thompson. Joe felt the child start and shrink against him. He did not reply, except by a look that was pleading and cautionary, which said, "Wait a moment for explanations, and be gentle." And, passing in, he carried Maggie to the small chamber on the first floor and laid her on a bed. Then, stepping back, he shut the door and stood face to face with his vinegar-tempered wife in the passageway outside. "You haven't brought home that sick brat!" Anger and astonishment were in the tones of Mrs. Joe Thompson. Her face was aflame. "I think women's hearts are sometimes very hard," said Joe. Usually, Joe Thompson got out of his wife's way or kept rigidly silent and non-combative when she fired up on any subject. It was with some surprise, therefore, that she now encountered a firmly set countenance and a resolute pair of eyes. Women's hearts are not half so hard as men's. Joe saw, by a quick intuition, that his resolute bearing had impressed his wife, and he answered quickly and with real indignation. Be that as it may, every woman at the funeral turned her eyes steadily from the sick child's face, and when the cart went off with her dead mother, hurried away and left her alone in that old hut, with the sun not an hour in the sky. "Where were John and Kate?" asked Mrs. Thompson. Farmer Jones tossed John into his wagon and drove off. Kate went home with Mrs. Ellis. But nobody wanted the poor sick one. "Send her to the poorhouse," was the cry. "Why didn't you let her go then? What did you bring her here for?" "She can't walk to the poorhouse," said Joe. "Somebody's arms must carry her, and mine are strong enough for that task." "Then why didn't you keep on? Why did you stop here?" demanded the wife. "Because I'm not apt to go on fool's errands. The guardians must first be seen and a permit obtained." There was no gainsaying this. "When will you see the guardians?" she asked with irrepressible impatience. "Tomorrow." "Why put it off till tomorrow? Go at once for the permit and get the whole thing off your hands tonight." "Jane," said the wheelwright with an impressiveness of tone that greatly subdued his wife, "I read in the Bible sometimes and find much said about little children, how the Savior rebuked the disciples who would not receive them, how he took them up in his arms and blessed them, and how he said that whosoever gave them even a cup of cold water should not go unrewarded. Now, it is a small thing for us to keep this poor motherless little one for a single night, to be kind to her for a single night, to make her life comfortable for a single night." The voice of the strong, rough man shook, and he turned his head away so that the moisture in his eyes might not be seen. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but a soft feeling crept into her heart. "Look at her kindly, Jane. Speak to her kindly," said Joe. "Think of her dead mother, and the loneliness, the pain, the sorrow that must be on all her coming life." The softness of his heart gave unwonted eloquence to his lips. Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment, then her expression softened. "Bring her in," she finally said, her voice less harsh. "I'll make her some supper and see to her for tonight." Joe's face brightened. He went back to the small chamber, lifted Maggie gently, and carried her into the warm, inviting kitchen. Mrs. Thompson busied herself with preparing some food, and when she turned to look at Maggie, her eyes met a pair of large, frightened eyes filled with tears. "Hello there, Maggie," she said, trying to make her voice sound kind. "Are you hungry, dear?" Maggie nodded shyly. "Well, let's get you something to eat and make you comfortable." As Mrs. Thompson served the child a warm bowl of broth and a piece of bread, Joe watched with a sense of relief. The barrier had been crossed, and he felt certain that his wife's natural kindness, buried deep under layers of life's hardness, would emerge and embrace the orphaned girl. Mrs. Thompson did not reply, but presently turned towards the little chamber where her husband had deposited Maggie, and, pushing open the door, went quietly in. Joe did not follow. He saw that her state had changed and felt that it would be best to leave her alone with the child. So he went to his shop, which stood near the house, and worked until dusky evening released him from labor. A light shining through the little chamber window was the first object that attracted Joe's attention on turning towards the house. It was a good omen. The path led him by this window, and, when opposite, he could not help pausing to look in. It was now dark enough outside to screen him from observation. Maggie lay a little raised on the pillow with the lamp shining full upon her face. Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the bed, talking to the child, but her back was towards the window, so her countenance was not seen. From Maggie's face, therefore, Joe must read the character of their intercourse. He saw that her eyes were intently fixed upon his wife, that now and then a few words came, as if in answer from her lips, that her expression was sad and tender, but he saw nothing of bitterness or pain. A deep-drawn breath was followed by one of relief, as a weight lifted itself from his heart. On entering, Joe did not go immediately to the little chamber. His heavy tread about the kitchen brought his wife somewhat hurriedly from the room where she had been with Maggie. Joe thought it best not to refer to the child, nor to manifest any concern in regard to her. "How soon will supper be ready?" he asked. "Right soon," answered Mrs. Thompson, beginning to bustle about. There was no asperity in her voice. Joe sat down and picked up a newspaper, trying to appear casual. After a few minutes, he ventured, "Is she settled in for the night?" "Yes," Mrs. Thompson replied. "I've made her comfortable. Poor thing, she's had a hard time." Joe nodded, sensing a softening in his wife's tone. "I figured as much. We'll talk to the guardians tomorrow, but for tonight, it's good that she's in a warm bed." Mrs. Thompson was silent for a moment, then said, "Maybe she could stay a few days, just until she's a bit stronger. It wouldn't be right to send her off too soon." Joe hid a smile behind his newspaper. "We'll see what the guardians say," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. As they sat down to supper, Joe felt a sense of peace. The house felt warmer, not just from the fire in the hearth, but from the small spark of compassion that had been kindled in his wife's heart. Joe sat silently for a few moments, holding the small, delicate hand in his own, feeling the warmth of her gratitude seep into his heart. He realized that this frail child had already found a place in his heart, a place he hadn't known was empty until she filled it. "Well, Maggie," he said softly, "we're going to take good care of you. You rest now, and if you need anything, just call out. I'll be right here." "Thank you, sir," Maggie whispered, her eyes closing as she settled back into the soft pillows. Joe quietly left the room, closing the door gently behind him. He returned to the kitchen where his wife was setting the table for supper. "How is she?" Mrs. Thompson asked, a hint of concern in her voice. "She's comfortable," Joe replied. "She says the soft bed feels good, and she hasn't had any pain since lying down." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We'll see how she does through the night. Maybe we can talk to the doctor tomorrow and see what he says." Joe smiled, feeling a wave of relief and gratitude towards his wife. "That sounds like a good plan." As they sat down to supper, the warmth of their home seemed to extend beyond the fire in the hearth, enveloping them in a newfound sense of compassion and purpose. The presence of the little girl had brought a softening to their hearts, and Joe knew that, whatever happened, Maggie had already changed their lives for the better. After supper, Mrs. Thompson prepared a small tray with some food and took it to Maggie's room. Joe followed her quietly and stood at the door as she entered the room. Maggie's eyes lit up when she saw Mrs. Thompson, and she managed a weak smile. "Are you hungry, dear?" Mrs. Thompson asked gently. "A little," Maggie replied. Mrs. Thompson helped her sit up slightly and then fed her small bites of food, speaking to her in a soothing voice all the while. Joe watched with a sense of deep contentment, feeling the barriers around his wife's heart slowly crumbling. Once Maggie had eaten, Mrs. Thompson adjusted the pillows and tucked the blankets around her snugly. "You get some rest now, Maggie. We'll be right outside if you need anything," she said softly. "Thank you, ma'am," Maggie whispered, her eyelids already drooping with exhaustion. Joe and Mrs. Thompson left the room quietly, closing the door behind them. In the kitchen, Joe took his wife's hand in his and squeezed it gently. "Thank you, Jane," he said simply. Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She's just a child, Joe. She needs us." Joe nodded, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and love for his wife. "We'll take care of her," he promised. "Together, we'll make sure she's safe and loved." And so, in the quiet warmth of their home, with hearts softened by compassion and love, Joe and Mrs. Thompson found a new sense of purpose and connection. Little Maggie had brought a light into their lives, a light that promised to shine brightly for many days to come. "Supper is ready," said Mrs. Thompson, looking into the room a little while afterwards. Joe glanced from his wife's face to that of Maggie. She understood him and answered, "She can wait until we are done. Then I will bring her something to eat." There was an effort at indifference on Mrs. Thompson's part, but her husband had seen her through the window and understood that the coldness was assumed. Joe waited, after sitting down at the table, for his wife to introduce the subject uppermost in both of their minds, but she remained silent on that theme for many minutes, and he maintained a similar reserve. At last, she said abruptly, "What are you going to do with that child?" "I thought you understood that she was to go to the poorhouse," replied Joe, as if surprised at her question. Mrs. Thompson looked rather strangely at her husband for some moments, then dropped her eyes. The subject was not again referred to during the meal. At its close, Mrs. Thompson toasted a slice of bread and softened it with milk and butter. Adding to this a cup of tea, she took them into Maggie's room and held the small tray on which she had placed them, while the hungry child ate with every sign of pleasure. "Is it good?" asked Mrs. Thompson, seeing with what a keen relish the food was taken. The child paused with the cup in her hand and answered with a look of gratitude that awoke to new life old human feelings which had been slumbering in her heart for half a score of years. "We'll keep her a day or two longer. She is so weak and helpless," said Mrs. Joe Thompson, in answer to her husband's remark at breakfast time on the next morning, that he must step down and see the guardians of the poor about Maggie. "She'll be so much in your way," said Joe. "I shan't mind that for a day or two. Poor thing." Joe did not see the guardians of the poor on that day, on the next, nor on the day following. In fact, he never saw them at all on Maggie's account. For in less than a week, Mrs. Joe Thompson would as soon leave thought of taking up her own abode in the almshouse as sending Maggie there. What light and blessing did that sick and helpless child bring to the home of Joe Thompson, the poor wheelwright? It had been dark and cold and miserable there for a long time just because his wife had nothing to love and care for out of herself, and so became sore, irritable, ill-tempered, and self-afflicting in the desolation of her woman's nature. Now the sweetness of that sick child, looking ever to her in love, patience, and gratitude, was as honey to her soul, and she carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. As for Joe Thompson, there was not a man in all the neighborhood who drank daily of a more precious wine of life than he. An angel had come into his house, disguised as a sick, helpless, and miserable child, and filled all its dreary chambers with the sunshine of love.